The rain never stopped in the bottoms. It came down in sheets, in needles, in the particular fine mist that settled on your eyelashes, and made the neon bleed sideways across every wet surface until the city looked like a fever dream designed by a committee, which, in a sense, it was. Mako Chen stood in the green room. They still called it a green room, though. The walls were the color of old bone. And listened to the crowd noise filtering through the building's guts. 40,000 humans in the Cascade Arena, plus the 17 million watching on sanctioned feeds across sectors 2 through 9. He could feel the noise in his molars. 5 minutes, lil brother, said Petra, not looking up from her tablet. She was his handler, officially designated Cultural Production Coordinator, which was the alien administration's way of saying she made sure he said the right things in the right order and smiled at the right moments so the compliance numbers stayed green. Mako looked at himself in the mirror. The costume was orange and white, the colors of Halo Beverage, Earth's most consumed licensed product under the Vreth occupation. He wore a stylized sun emblem on his chest. The helmet was off, waiting on the table beside a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. And without it, he was just a 34-year-old man from what used to be Chicago, with a scar over his left eyebrow and eyes that had been doing the math for 6 years without arriving at a number he liked. The bit about unity, Petra said. They added a line. They always add a line. This one's different. She held the tablet toward him. He read it. He read it again. The tablet down without a word and picked up the coffee. It wasn't different. That was the thing. To anyone else in the bottoms, it would have looked like more of the same. The gentle reminder that cooperation with Vreth administrative decisions led to resource allocation, that dissent was a form of self-harm, that lil brother loved everyone and wanted everyone to be safe and warm and fed. Please register your household's biometric compliance score by the 15th. Standard language. The kind of thing that had been in his scripts since year 1 of the occupation, sliding in 1 word at a time, 1 degree warmer each cycle, like a frog in water that never quite noticed the flame. The difference was a single phrase at the end. Sector assignments are a gift. Gratitude is the appropriate response. Sector assignments. That was new. 3 days ago, the Vreth administrative body had announced a resettlement optimization program, a reshuffling, population distribution, across the 11 remaining habitable zones on the continent. 60 million people moved. The official rationale was resource efficiency. The unofficial rationale, everyone in the bottoms whispered about, in hallways and stairwells. And the kinds of bars that didn't have compliance monitors, was something worse and vaguer and harder to name. Something that made people go quiet when they tried. Mako had a name for it. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. He put the helmet on. The crowd noise resolved into something physical, a wall of sound that hit as soon as he stepped through the curtain into the arena's service corridor. He could feel the vibration in his sternum. 40,000 people chanting the name of a cartoon sun mascot, a character he'd inhabited for 6 years, a face that appeared on every Halo vending point in the bottoms, every sanctioned screen, every civic broadcast. Lil brother, the approved face of human compliance, smiling and bright and endlessly, relentlessly cheerful. The lights found him when he stepped onto the stage. Crowd erupted. He waved. He did the gesture. The double tap on the sun emblem, both fists, then open palms toward the crowd. And the roar went up another level. 40,000 people doing it back at him, tapping their own chests, opening their palms. Because that was the bit. That was the thing. It had been in every show for 3 years, and it meant nothing except that they here and he was here. And for 38 minutes they could pretend the city outside was not what it was. He started the patter. The jokes landed. The music cue hit. He moved through the first 20 minutes on autopilot. Performance so deeply grooved it. Ran in a separate track from his actual mind, which was doing something else entirely. He was counting faces. He'd been counting faces at every show for 6 months, ever since his friend Deo, an engineer who worked the water reclamation plant in Sector 4, had told him something at a bar. Dio had been 2 drinks past careful, which was why he'd said it, and 1 drink short of blackout, was why he hadn't remembered saying it the next morning. What he'd said was this: The compliance scoring that fed into Halo's viewership metrics wasn't just demographic data. It wasn't just used to sell the alien administration on the value of the sanctioned entertainment program. It was being cross-referenced with the sector reassignment algorithm. Mako hadn't understood at first. Then Dio had explained, in the voice of a man who was absolutely going to forget this conversation, that the Vreth administrative system was sorting humans the same way a farmer sorted livestock before a culling. The ones who watched Lil Brother and smiled and tapped their chests and registered high compliance scores were being moved to the resource-positive sectors. The ones who scored low, who watched with the wrong facial expression or changed the channel or didn't watch at all, those were the ones in the sector assignments announced 3 days ago. 60 million people, sorted by whether they'd laughed at his jokes. Thought lived in his chest, like a stone he couldn't cough up. He hit his mark for the Halo product integration. The part where he took the can, did open, made the expression, said the line, and the crowd cheered, and somewhere in the arena's technical gallery, a Vreth compliance monitor was watching the biometric readouts from 40,000 implanted registration chips, and noting which humans responded correctly. He cracked the can. He made the expression. He started to say the line. He said something else instead. Not much. Not enough to register as deviation. He'd thought hard about what the threshold was, where the line sat between allowable variation and a correctable incident. He said the line, but with a particular pause before the last word, a 2-beat rest that wasn't in the script, the kind of thing a performer did naturally, the kind of thing a compliance monitor would score as stylistic latitude. But it was a real pause, a human pause, the kind that said, I know you're here, I see you, I'm thinking. 2 people in the front row caught it. He saw it in their faces, the tiny flicker, the micro-expression, the moment of recognition that passed between him and them and nobody else in the building. 2 people out of 40,000. He filed their faces away and kept moving. After the show, in the green room, Petra was pleased. Compliance numbers were excellent. The new line had landed without incident. The sector assignment messaging had been received positively by 83% of the monitored audience. Mako nodded and said the right things and went home. He lived in a 4th-floor apartment in what used to be Pilsen, a neighborhood that still had its bones, if not its name. The building had a doorman named Olu, who was 72 years old and had been a professor of literature before the occupation, and who now checked compliance badges with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had decided that surviving was not the same as surrendering, and who kept a battered paperback behind his desk that he read during slow hours. Tonight the paperback was visible when Mako came in, and Olu looked up and said quietly, You paused. Mako stopped. You watched? I always watch. The old man's eyes were steady. On my daughter's feed, she doesn't know I watch. Mako stood in the lobby for a long moment. Olu, I know. The old man picked up his compliance badge scanner and checked it was powered down, which it always was at this hour, which they both knew. My daughter is Sector 6, one of the new assignments. Mako went upstairs. He sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours without moving. The coffee he'd made went cold. Outside his window, the bottoms glowed in its usual fever dream way, neon on rain. Giant haloed pillar 3 blocks east, cycling through its 8-second loop. The can, the expression, the line, the emblem, with his own face 30 meters tall, smiling down at the wet street. It had been flattering once. Or not flattering, strained in a way that felt significant. The way a person's voice sounds wrong recorded back to them. Now it just looked like a leash with good lighting. He was the most watched human being in the occupied zones. 17 million people. Every show. The Vreth administration had not built Lil Brother to pacify the population. Humans had pitched it to them in year 2 of the occupation as a compliance program, a way to demonstrate cultural productivity, to buy breathing room for the remaining population centers. The administration had approved it because it worked. Because the metrics confirmed what the pitch had promised. Humans who had something to laugh at were humans who didn't organize in the ways that required suppression. The show was cheap control, cheaper than enforcement. The Vreth had never understood what they'd actually built. They thought they were funding a pacification tool. They'd actually funded the only mass communication infrastructure in the occupied zones that wasn't directly monitored by their own systems. Because the whole premise of the show, the whole reason it worked, was that it felt human, organic, ungoverned. The compliance monitoring happened at the audience end, not the production end. The Vreth watched the numbers. They didn't watch the show. They watched the data. They didn't speak the language. Mako sat at his kitchen table and thought about what he'd seen in the faces of those two people in the front row when he'd paused. He thought about Olu's daughter in Sector 6. He thought about 60 million people being moved to wherever the Vreth moved people they'd decided were low value, which was a word for a thing he'd been refusing to name for 6 months and was going to stop refusing to name right now. He got up and went to the drawer under the kitchen counter where he kept his tools. Real tools, hand tools, a legacy of the trade school, years before everything changed, and found the small RF signal tester he'd bought at a salvage market 3 years ago, ostensibly for checking signal bleed in the apartment, and used it to confirm what he already suspected, which was that his apartment was the one space in the bottoms that Petra's production protocols had designated as a talent privacy zone, meaning no ambient monitoring, because the administration had been persuaded that a performer needed genuine off hours to maintain authentic effect, camera, which was true, which was also the thing that was going to matter. He made a new cup of coffee and started writing. It took him 3 weeks to find the two people from the front row. It wasn't hard. He knew the arena's ticketing system, knew which seats they'd been in, knew a woman in sector administration who owed him a favor from a time when he'd personally appealed a compliance flag on her son's behalf. Their names were Yuki and Tarrant. Yuki was a former broadcast technician who now worked in the arena's maintenance crew. Tarrant had been an architect. They met in the green room, just the three of them before an off-cycle rehearsal. Mako explained what he knew. He explained slowly, and without drama, the way you explain something to people who need to be able to think about it clearly. Not the way you explain it to an audience, he explained. The compliance cross-referencing, the sector assignments, what Dio had told him in the bar. He explained what he thought was happening to the 60 million. Though he used careful language for the part he couldn't prove. Yuki listened without moving. When he finished, she said, "The broadcast infrastructure." "Yes. You want to flip it. I want to use it to say something real." He looked at them both. One broadcast, one show where Lil Brother says the actual thing, tells people what the sector assignments mean, tells them where the compliance scoring goes, tells them that their faces are being read and their reactions are being sorted, and they need to understand what they're inside. Tarrant was quiet for a long moment. He had the look of a man running load calculations on a structure he couldn't yet see. They'll shut it down mid-broadcast. Probably inside the first 4 minutes. Maybe 6 if Petra's team is slow to escalate. That's not enough time to. It's enough time. Mako looked at them steadily. I've been performing to that audience for 6 years. I know what lands in 30 seconds. I know how to make something stick in 4 minutes that doesn't come out for years. That's what I do. He paused. The real kind. That's the only thing they never understood. They thought they were buying a product. They bought a language. Broadcast was scheduled for the last Friday of the month. The monthly Halo community show. The highest viewership slot in the cycle. 17 million people, plus the arena crowd. The Vreth compliance monitors would be running standard observation protocols, watching the biometric numbers roll in, watching the data, not watching the show. There were 3 things they needed. Yuki mapped them on a piece of actual paper, which she burned afterward. First, the standard pre-show window before Petra's team finalized the feed handoff to the administration's network, a gap of approximately 11 minutes, during which the production feed ran through the arena's legacy broadcast infrastructure before being converted and relayed. Yuki knew the system. She could hold the handoff, delay it by cycling a legitimate-looking diagnostic loop on the conversion encoder, buying an additional 4 to 6 minutes of direct human broadcast before the Vreth network took over. Second, a script, not a performance script, real one. The kind that said true things in the language of a man who'd been talking to 17 million people long enough to know how they heard. Third, someone to witness. Someone with a record. That third one turned out to be Olu, who arrived at the arena on the night of the broadcast, carrying a small recording device inside the spine of his battered paperback, who sat in a press observation booth that Yuki had flagged as maintenance access, who recorded everything from the moment Mako stepped onto the stage. Mako did the first 8 minutes straight. The jokes, the music cue, the Halo integration, the can, the expression, the line. He was perfect. The compliance numbers were green. The biometric readouts from the arena chips were nominal. In the gallery, the Vreth monitors watched the data. At 8 minutes and 40 seconds, he stopped. He stood at the front of the stage and he took the helmet off. He'd never done that in a live show. The crowd went confused quiet. That particular silence of 40,000 people recalibrating. And in that silence, he stood with the helmet under his arm and looked at them and just waited. 1 beat, 2. Long enough for the silence to become real rather than reactive, for people to settle into it and feel its weight. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." His voice without the performance effect was different. Lower. It was his actual voice. The one from before, the one that had grown up in a neighborhood that no longer existed. And it moved through the arena like something physical. He told them, 4 minutes and 11 seconds start to finish. He told them about the compliance scoring and what it fed into. He told them about the sector assignments and what the administration called the population they'd marked as low value in the actual Vreth administrative term, which translated most cleanly as expendable density. He told them that the show had been a tool of their sorting, and that he had been the instrument of it without knowing, and that he was sorry for that, in the specific human way that sorry means something, and not in the way that it means nothing. He told them that 60 million people were being moved to places they would not come back from, and that the administration believed that the remaining population was too pacified to object. He told them they were wrong about that. He said it in the language of Lil Brother, not the script, but the rhythm, the cadence, the specific frequency he'd calibrated over 6 years to land in the place. Behind the sternum, where people kept the things they meant. He'd stolen the voice of a product mascot and used it to say the one thing a product mascot was never supposed to say, which was the truth. 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the feed cut. The arena lights died for 3 seconds. Then the emergency systems brought up the standard blue-white. In the sudden changed light, 40,000 people sat very still. Then the noise started. It was not the noise of a crowd being entertained. It was not the noise of 40,000 people responding correctly to a stimulus. It was something older. Something the compliance monitor's instruments weren't built to measure. Something that had been waiting under the green numbers and the good metrics and the dutiful chest taps for 6 years. Mako stood on the dark stage and listened to it and felt it move through him, and he was afraid, and he was not sorry, which is a very particular human combination that does not translate into any Vreth administrative category. What happened next took weeks. Broadcast recording, blues recording, small and clear and complete, moved through the bottoms in the old ways, in person, in whispers, in the kind of transmission that happens between humans who have decided something and don't need a network to decide it together. 17 million people had seen 4 minutes and 11 seconds of it live before the feed cut on. And word of mouth is a technology the Vreth administration had never successfully mapped. Because it has no signal. It moves in the spaces between monitored things, in the looks between people in corridors, and the specific way a person hands something to another person without looking at their hands. The sector assignment program slowed, stopped. The Vreth administration was not the kind of entity that reversed course easily, and whatever they planned for the 60 million did not evaporate because a man took his helmet off on a stage. But it slowed, visibly, measurably, in the way that a mechanism slows when there is friction introduced into parts that were supposed to run smooth. The administration had been counting on the compliance numbers staying green. The compliance numbers were no longer reliably green. People were still tapping their chests at Halo vending points, still performing the correct behaviors in monitored spaces, But the parametric data from inside those behaviors had shifted in ways the breath instruments noted without understanding. The instruments were measuring bodies. Bodies can be compliant without consent. The administration had never built a tool that could measure the difference. Mako was arrested 72 hours after the broadcast. He'd expected that. He'd had 72 hours to do what needed doing, which was more than he'd honestly counted on, and he used all of them. It happened at his apartment building, where Olu was at his desk reading his paperback with the recording device back in its spine, and Olu watched with his particular neutral expression as they took Mako through the lobby, and Mako caught his eye on the way out and made a gesture. Not the little brother gesture, something older, something his grandmother had made in a kitchen in Chicago when he was small. A flat-palmed push that meant, "Keep moving, we're not done." Olu's hand moved slightly under the desk, a small mirror of it. The detention processing took 6 hours, during which Mako was calm, in the way that people are calm when they have already decided the thing that mattered and the thing in front of them is just consequence. A Vreth administrative officer, they wore translating collars. Their actual voices pitched below human hearing, reviewed the broadcast footage on a screen across the table, and said, through the collar's processed output, that he had engaged in unauthorized communication, that he had violated his cultural production coordinator agreement, that he had potentially endangered the stability of the administrative settlement program. Mako looked at the officer across the table. The officer had 4 upper limbs folded in a posture Mako had learned to read as something between irritated and uncertain, a combination that in the Vreth hierarchy meant the situation was outside the officer's behavioral parameters. They'd expected fear or defiance or calculation. What they were getting was a man who looked like he'd finished a long job. "What do you want from me?" the officer said through the collar. "I don't want anything from you," Mako said. "I already did the thing." The officer looked at the screen, then back at him. "Your cultural production agreement. I know what it says." Mako leaned back in his chair. "I also know what your resettlement optimization program says, because I told 17 million people what it says, 4 minutes and 11 seconds of it, and that's going to be harder to unpack than whatever you do with me now." He paused. The real kind, 2-beat kind, the one that said, "Thinking, and I know you're here. Your system assumes that compliance and consent are the same thing. They're not. We learned that about ourselves a long time ago. You haven't learned it yet." The officer's upper limbs shifted. Uncertain now, mostly. "You talk too much," the officer said. "It's a human problem," Mako said. "We've been doing it for 100,000 years. We do it when we're scared and when we're brave and when we're in between, and we do it to each other and to whatever is in the room, and you can stop the broadcast, but you can't stop the thing the broadcast was made of, because we didn't invent it, we just carry it." He looked at the officer steadily. "You bought a man who could talk to 17 million people. Thought. You were buying the talking. You were buying the people." He was held for 31 days. During those 31 days, resettlement figures dropped by 40%. The Vreth administration attributed this to logistical recalibration. The bottom's population, watching the administrative statements on sanction screens, understood it differently. On day 31, Mako was processed out through a secondary facility exit. He was given back his personal effects. The scar over his left eyebrow had company now, a smaller one at his jawline from the initial apprehension, and released into the city without explanation, which was itself a statement the administration was making about the math. Punishing him cost them more than releasing him. They were making the calculation they knew how to make. They were still not making the other one. Olu was waiting at the apartment building when he got back. The old man looked at him for a long moment. The way you look at someone you weren't certain you'd see again. And then he went back to his paperback and didn't say anything, and Mako went upstairs. His apartment had been searched, methodically, professionally, by people who knew what they were looking for, and hadn't found it because there was nothing to find. He stood in the center of his kitchen and looked at the halo ad pillar outside his window, still cycling, his face still 30 meters tall in the rain. The can, the expression, the line, the emblem. He went to his drawer and got his coffee out and made a cup. And while it brewed, he looked at his own face in the dark window glass, over the glow of the street, and he thought about the two people in the front row 6 months ago, and Olu's daughter in Sector 6, and Dio in a bar saying the thing he'd forget, and 40,000 people sitting very still in the sudden blue-white light. He thought about the Vreth officer saying, "You talk too much," in the voice of something that had decided words were a nuisance and not a weapon. He picked up his cup. He drank. The coffee was good. It had always been good. The cheap local stuff, the kind that came in dented cans from the market on Halstead, that still ran in the mornings, regardless of sector assignments or compliance programs or the weather that never stopped. It tasted like it had always tasted. The Vreth had not yet found a way to administrate the taste of coffee. Give them time. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened a new document and started writing. He had 17 million people who knew his voice. He had a city that had been teaching itself to listen between the lines for 6 years. He had 100,000 years of human beings talking to each other in rooms the powerful hadn't gotten into yet, passing the thing from hand to hand, saying, "Keep moving, we're not done." He had never, in the end, been the product. He'd been the producer. It was time to make something else.